last class. Right, we're almost done with all of this stuff. You guys got a paper due on Thursday, right? I put up the last optional worksheet today. I've graded the 8 that were in. You should have those all back, right? Some of you are missing some things. I think I told you about that, right? In emails. But remember that the last 2 worksheets are to make up for bad grades on earlier ones, right? I'll grade the top 8 for each one of you. But you can go back and look and just average out the percentage, right? So each one at the bottom of the page says, 16 out of 17, 94% or something like that, right? Just take all of those and average them, right? Add them all up, divide by 8, if you've turned them all in, and that will be where you are. And if you're in the 90s, you're an A. If you're in the 80s, you're probably a B. 70s a C, 60s a D. Right? It's that simple. And then you can know whether or not you needed those last 2 to bump that up a little bit, right? So I will average the top 8, all right? And I made the other one, the post-impressionism one, due on Wednesday, just to not have it due the same day as your paper, right? But I'd take it as late as Friday. Okay, you need till Friday. Go ahead and do the paper first, and then the worksheet later. That kind of makes more sense now that I'm thinking about it. Okay, so those are coming up. The final is week after next. We'll talk a little bit more about it on Thursday. But we should be able to cover all the works that are on the study sheet before then. So be sure you get cracking on that. The PowerPoint that I put up today will have everything through the worksheet. It's all up there now, right? I may change it some because I always do at the last minute, revise it a little bit. So there we are. Okay, any questions on all of that? Alrighty, we were talking about Impressionism and as a movement, which very much is deeply indebted to the Realist movement, which was born in the middle of the 19th century, where artists began to focus on mundane activities of everyday life, right? Non-newsworthy events, just things that are happening, trying to champion the lot of the working class, use art as a social agenda, but also then focus on those things of everyday experience that might otherwise escape notice and not be remembered by future generations. And the Impressionists grew directly out of that movement because they too are very much interested in ordinary everyday life, or ordinary everyday modern life, right? That's the big thing, is the modern element of it. And beginning with the Realists and continuing with the Impressionists is a modern way of painting. Paint the modern world in a modern way. And this is one of the things that leads to this very anti-academic style, where the brushstrokes are left obvious to the eye, where it seems sketchy. This is how they got their name, from a negative review of the first Impressionist show. They were simply called Society of Artists and Painters, right? Independent Society of Artists and Painters. And they got this negative review, and the name sort of stuck, and now we use it as a form of praise. But originally it was intended as a negative criticism. And the Impressionists were a multi-natured group. Not everybody's paintings looked like Monet. Not everybody tackled the same themes. Monet loves water, not exclusively, but loves images of the Seine River, of the ocean, because he's so much interested in the play of light. Pissarro is interested in scenes of everyday rural life, life in the villages outside of Paris. This sort of separates him from Manet and that trend of realism that focused on life in the city. And he always depicts rural life as if it were this peaceful, idyllic, idealized kind of condition, where work happens, but it's never that tough, where it's the kind of life that you might want to lead. And this comes from his politics. He was very strongly politically motivated, and he felt that the working poor sort of had it figured out, that there was something to be said about not trying to get ahead, not trying to join the rat race, if you will. And his pictures really show that element of his sort of disdain for big city living, and sort of stepping on the little guy to get ahead. Right? He actually belonged to the anarchist party, not necessarily the same anarchist party you see today, throwing rocks at Starbucks and that sort of thing, but it was a sort of a mainstream left-wing party in late 19th century France. At the end of class, then, we were looking at Degas, another member of the original group of 30 artists who grouped together in 1873 for that first exhibition in 1874. Although Degas hated the term Impressionism because he said he's very deliberate. There's nothing impressionist about his work. It's all very thoughtful, very deliberate. And as we look at his compositions, I think you can see some of that. There's this sense that he's being very, very careful about how he arranges the figures within this space, how he arranges the pauses, the visual pauses between the figures. Also very much important to him. So this green wall with the brown wainscoting on the left. Even the broad, almost panoramic format, right? It suggests that he's really interested in sort of compositional organization and how we get this crowding in the upper right corner and then sort of loosens out as we move to the left. On the right, again, amazingly thoughtful and deliberate composition where we see, as this rehearsal for a dance, we see the figures there, but we see some figures grouped tightly in the lower right corner, another group in the room in the back. But the sense of articulation and the arrangement of the figures in space is something that Degas is really strong with, and he loves cropping. He loves cropping scenes awkwardly. Look at on the left-hand side that spiral staircase coming down, and we see the ballerina's feet just coming down the stairs at the upper left corner, and how behind it, right behind it, there are these figures that are just masked out, right? So if we look, I think I might have a detail of that coming up, but if we look past the stairs, you see a woman. I don't know. My sister did ballet when I don't remember what the names of these things are, right? But there she is practicing one of the foot placements right behind the stairs. And then back behind it on the left, in the opening that you see right next to the frame, there's a foot sort of coming out. They're sort of like they're fragmented, and this become these compositional elements. He's so fantastic that way, right, in arranging them. But what makes him an impressionist? Well, he's part of the group, right? That's really the big issue. He was part of the group, whether he liked the term or not, because the group didn't have a series of sort of membership application boxes that you had to check off, to be part of the group of Impressionists. That said, there are certain things that he does share with Monet, with Pissarro. Broken brushwork. Look at the floor on the left, especially in the foreground, and you can see the sort of scrubby nature of how the paint has been put down. Throughout the dance class on the right, which we'll focus more on, you can see various places where the brushwork looks almost abstract on the surface, where it just becomes these splotches of color, which is really what, element that was sort of started by Manet within the realist movement, and taken up by the Impressionists, all of whom were friends with him. So here's a detail, right, where we can see the degree to which the paint has that sort of, we get close enough and it becomes just abstract patches of color and paint, whether on the woman in red with her yellow bow on the back, or the pink bow of the woman bending over on the left. At a certain point with his works, he's trying to capture the sense of the taffeta and the gossamer of the tutus, and he does that through making it very, very unresolved, right? So you behind the girl bending over, you can see how the legs become sort of diaphanous behind that material, and he uses the scrubbiness of the paint as a way of articulating that, right? Also, I think he wants it to capture a sort of sense of motion and movement. You know, Monet uses broken brushwork to capture flickering light, right? Changing light. Well, Degas' kind of interested in change as well. Everybody's moving. He's capturing a very particular moment. He shares that with Monet. And the brushwork, the way he puts the paint on the canvas, suggests something immediate and instantaneous, momentary, rather than lasting. And that sort of puts him very firmly in the Impressionist camp. He also, I think, is just as interested in the play of light within the interior. I think we can see this, the way the light folds around the figures doing their steps, how shadows sort of disappear as the light permeates into the darkness cast by the legs of that dancer. But here we can also see one of the things that Degas is absolutely terrific at, and that is these really brave compositional choices, where he's cropping the painting in an unexpected way. And that cropping also adds to the sense of a momentary instant. That even though it's so consciously composed, it sort of suggests a snapshot in a way, right? That it's sort of, you know, he's just turned there for a second and he's not going to bother to arrange things in the classical manner, right? Where you would have, you know, mountains on either side that would frame the figures in the center. He loves cutting them off, having them come in and move out of the frame that he's chosen. And that adds also to this instantaneous moment that seems to be a hallmark of a lot of Impressionist art. Right? Now, in this case, like I said, this staircase that runs down the left-hand side really is a very bold choice, the way it blocks out some of the things that he ostensibly is there to paint. Manet did that too, right? We think about the railway, right? He even titles it the railway, and yet there's no railway to be seen because it's blocked out, even though his figure is more consciously composed within the frame. Here, Degas has the figures move out of the frame, but he also uses that staircase to block important parts of the composition. Right? And it enlivens it on a certain level. The post on the right, this separates that little anteroom in the back from us, also blocks out some kind of important parts of the composition, important ballerinas, right? And his influence for this is Japanese art. Beginning around 1850-ish, we start to see the influx of works of Japanese art into France. These are woodblock prints, colored woodblock prints. So each of the colors you see is a different block printed into the same field, right? And these started to be imported with fishmongers and whatnot already by the 1850s. And the Impressionists loved them. They're finding them just like laying on the streets sometimes. And they're picking these things up, and they're just really excited by some of the choices that Japanese artists are making. And in particular for Degas, this idea of blocking, right? Hiroshige is the best at this. He did 100 views of Tokyo. And that would have excited them too. Hiroshige in the 1850s, just 100 views of Tokyo. Modern world, right? Modern Japan. And they would have just absolutely adored that stuff. And so here with his print, we see this gate cutting off some of the figures, but also cutting off two of the boats as they move into the distance. And it's not an exact parallel to Degas, but the idea that runs behind it, which is this bold compositional blocking, is something that Degas responds to, right? And we'll see other artists at this time very much responding to Japanese art. There was even a Japanese pavilion at one of the world's fairs in the 1850s, another one in the 1860s, and these things all sort of heightened the sensitivity toward this new kind of art. So if we go back to what I was saying at the beginning of class, right? The Impressionists, like the realists before them, are interested in using a modern style to depict the modern world. That's part of what pushes them into this anti-academic, unpolished, impressionist style. Is the idea that if it's a modern scene, we should come up with a modern way to paint it. So they're consciously trying to break the standard rules of making art that go back to the Renaissance, right? Standard rules like perspective, like blending colors, right? They're trying to break all of that, and in fact, none of them really use perspective per se. Also, none of them really are that deeply focused on anatomy studies. All of these things that have been traditional art-making stuff. They're breaking all the rules. And Japanese art coming in also breaks these rules and offers them an example of how to make something that's still representational, but at the same time untraditional, at least insofar as Western art is concerned. And they adopt these along with the other techniques in order to make a modern art for the modern world. Now, as I mentioned, I think on Thursday, that Degas had 2 or 3 major themes that he dealt with repeatedly in his career. And all of them have to do with work. And all of them have to do with performance of a sort. So there was a great number of images of dancers. Those are the most famous, the ballerinas. And remember that in the 19th century, ballerinas were not esteemed in the same way that they are today. Ballerinas were hard workers. They still are hard workers, but they weren't seen as, capital A artists in the same way they are today. They were seen as grunts, right? It was hard work, and usually the women that did it, the girls that did it, came from impoverished families. And this was one way to have a respectable career, was to join the ballet, right? It wasn't what we think of today when we think of ballerinas, right? It was very, very different from that. And they often had a male supporter, a wealthy man who would give the family money to support the endeavor, right? We don't see any of those men here, but we imply the presence of Degas. Now, he was not one of these supporters, right? But he's sort of in their space. Ditto with After the Bath. Does Degas belong there? In a woman's bathroom as she's doing a tub bath, washing herself down? This is a private moment. Arguably so is the dance class. And in both of them, Degas is an outsider. He's a man in a woman's world, giving us a very privileged view of what goes on behind the curtain. In this respect, it's not very different from Ingres, who gave us those images of an odalisque, the harem girl. That's also a very privileged environment, right? Long tradition of this sort of, it's very sexist. It's objectifying women and then men inserting themselves into their world. This image, the Bathers by Degas, the number of versions of these, are in fact prostitutes. And like the ballerinas, what we see is the prostitute getting ready for a performance, if you will. Getting ready for work. Not in the act of, well, I guess you're not going to see that anyway, right? But not like Manet's Olympia, where she's receiving a visitor. But rather the peek behind the curtain, right? To see what goes on. Now, was he allowed back there? I don't know 100%. I think he must have been, right? Allowed to make some sketches here. But he's becomes interested in these images of performers not performing. Performers getting ready for the performance. And in fact, his third great series of works were race horses. And he never shows the race. He shows the horses getting ready for the race, the jockeys sort of trying to contain them before the race begins, right? Trotting around the field, getting ready, but not in the actual performance itself, which is a sort of fascinating side of Degas' work. So, impressionists in certain ways, right? The momentary, fleeting nature of the brushwork, suggesting something instantaneous, the cropping, adding to that idea that it's sort of a snapshot, right? An instant moment. But very different from either Monet or Pissarro, in the fact that he's focused still on labor, on work, like the realist, which is the term he preferred for himself, was a realist. One of my favorite Degas is this one on the left from the National Gallery, a woman at the Louvre, the museum in Paris, looking at pictures. And the woman in the picture is his best, well, not his best friend, but one of his good friends, the American painter Mary Cassatt. Right? That's Mary Cassatt on the left. She and Degas hung out together. And Degas invited her. She was from Philadelphia. Her family had moved to Paris when she was young. She'd learned to paint and had gotten quite good. Degas took notice of her pictures and invited her to join the Impressionists. She was one of 3 prominent women painters in the Impressionist group. They were a little bit forward-looking this way. We've talked before about how hard it was for women to be professional artists in earlier centuries, simply because the same opportunities were not available to them. Well, the Impressionists were one place where there was some opportunity. And Cassatt joined the Impressionists, even though she's not even French, right? She's an American. She's an expat, right? So there she is at the Louvre on the left, painted by Degas. He did 2 or 3 pictures of her here, some etchings as well. And you'll notice that as she's looking at the pictures, the Louvre is full of old master pictures, right? That's where the Mona Lisa is. And yet he turns the pictures on the wall of the Louvre into this sort of impressionist jumble of color, right? Really fabulous. I love the greens and yellows and oranges and reds right around her head. It's almost as if the ideas, the inspiration inside of her is kind of exploding out of it, you know? It's really a knockout picture. And he loves that outline that's carved by the sleeves of her dress. In fact, he's come back in with the yellow over the top of the black on your right to give you that wonderful sort of outline. Well, there's a Cassatt on the right. Rather than talking about Cassatt as an object, let's look at her as a painter. A little girl in a blue armchair. One of my 5 or 6 favorite pictures in the National Gallery. I just love this picture. I remember knowing it before I moved here and thinking, oh my God, it's here. Such a great picture. She's in probably the family house, maybe a member of the family. It's hard to say for sure. On this chair, and painted in a very impressionist manner, which is to say, with these darting, fleeting brushstrokes that suggest a momentary instant of time. And as we look closely at the picture, and I've got some nice details, you can see that what she's done is to take the floral pattern of this matching set of furniture, right? At least 3 comfy chairs and a love seat. And she takes the matching patterns and turns it into just this blaze of paint, of color on the surface. There's a nice detail, right? And the closer you look at it, the more you can see the degree to which the Impressionists are trying to make it look as if this took no time at all to paint. That's an effect they're trying to achieve. Now, is that the case? Probably not. These probably took just as long to paint as a Jacques-Louis David, maybe not quite as long as a Jan van Eyck, right? But they're not as immediate as they look. That's artifice to make it seem as if it's immediate, to make it seem as if it's instantaneous, right? A fleeting moment of everyday life. And the cropping of the picture also adds to that. The way the chair on the left doesn't quite fit into the frame. The dog's almost cut off. Look across the bottom. See all that bare canvas down there? Right? There's parts of the bottom of the picture that she hasn't even touched yet. But she's signed it. It's done. Right? And that adds to this idea that this is like a snapshot. Right? Now, it's worth noting that cameras are available now. Handheld personal cameras. People are walking around with them. Degas loved cameras. Right? Later on in his life, he started losing his eyesight, so he started taking pictures and working from photographs. Yeah. These are available. So you have the idea of the snapshot, where you capture things that happen that you can't really compose, where something walks into the frame while you're taking the picture. Someone moves out of the frame while you're taking the picture. That's available for artists. And that raised the question, if you can take a mechanical thing with this camera, then what do we need with paintings anymore? If I can just go snap, and we're done. And what do we need with paintings? Well, we need paintings that look like paintings. Right? We need paintings where the artistry is obvious. Right? There's a rivalry here with photography. That the painting is trying to look that much more painterly. That much less photographic. Because the photos are out there and they can do that just fine, thank you. Right? Now, most of our photos are still black and white. So the color that we see, this bright and incredible, lively color that we see in Impressionist art is also a response to this new technology. Like Degas, and probably because she was friends with Degas, Cassatt also loves Japanese art. As we look at this picture, I've been talking kind of close-up, micro, if you will, of the patterns, the brushwork that makes the patterns on the chairs. And she doesn't try to give you a sense of the organizational structure of those patterns. She just uses it as the opportunity to throw down some greens and some reds and some oranges and some yellows. But apart from that, if you back away, you'll notice the way in which Cassatt, I'm going to move over here for a second, she loves the organization of shapes across the surface, like a big jigsaw puzzle, where the edges of the chairs become for her sort of an important issue. And how, while we've got this really vibrant and lively treatment of those chairs, right? Look at the floor. It's pretty flat by comparison. It fades a bit to some yellowish green back by, I'm assuming, maybe a sliding glass door back there, right? Something leading out to a balcony, perhaps, right? But that shape in the center looks sort of like Africa, maybe, you know, right? The continent. It's not meant to, but just to give you a sense, this shape in here becomes a very recognizable shape as part of a composition. So do then sort of the blue bits around it become these recognizable shapes. You become aware of these isolated pieces. And at a certain point, when you look at the room and the organization of the furniture, there really isn't much in the way of an organization to the furniture. It seems as if it's sort of randomly strewn. It's hard to imagine an interior decorator deciding this is where these chairs go. The decision of the placement of the chairs is based on a sort of a compositional priority. Right? Trying to give you that sense of moving back into space without actually drawing it with perspective, just by using scale differences. Right? And there's a sort of a scattered randomness to where the different things are placed within the room. And this also seems to come very much from looking at Japanese prints. I'm going to show you an analogy again, right? Another Hiroshige print. Just the way in which I've always, this is not a direct thing, right? But look at the way that Hiroshige scatters the islands and the boats. And how the sea, right, becomes this sort of unvaried, it gets a little bit darker, but there's not a lot of rendering in it. It's just this one large sort of flat tone that comes down, and what we have against that are the rendered elements that have a sort of wonderful randomness to the way they seem to be scattered across that blue field. And I think on a certain level, that's what Cassatt is doing as well. Right? Scattering these blue chairs across that, mossy brown background, mossy brown floor. Now, one last thing to talk about with Cassatt. We've talked about paint application, overall composition. One last thing to talk about with Cassatt is the issue of being a woman artist. The issue of being a woman, period, in the Third Republic, in France in the late 19th century. The right of women were nowhere near what they are today. I mean, we still got a long ways to go in 21st century America, but in 19th century France, it was much more difficult. Because when we talked before about artists, women artists in particular, not having the same opportunity as male artists, Cassatt, being part of the Impressionists, couldn't simply walk out by herself, set up an easel, and paint landscapes like Pissarro could, like Monet could. However much she might have wanted to be. Simply because the rules of society said that women did not go out alone unaccompanied. They had to go in the company of other women, or even more preferably in the company of men. And if you didn't, if you were a woman out by yourself, you were more likely to be harassed. That's still true today, isn't it? Right? But even more so then, because it was believed, and I think men still fall into this stupid trap. It was believed that they were available for pickup, right? And we kind of saw that with the Manet, didn't we? The railway. There she is. She's got a kid. She's working. She has to be out, right? But still, there's this guy that's bothered her. She's got to put her finger in the book somewhere, right? But they were seen as available, and even more than available, they're often seen as prostitutes. Those were the women who were out by themselves. If you were out by yourself, you were looking for company. That was the assumption on the part of men. So for Cassatt, being an Impressionist artist, what we see are images that she has the opportunity to paint. With Cassatt, we have significantly more interior images than exterior images. Images where women are inside and kind of unable to go out. And I think that's what makes this picture so fantastic. This kid is so squirmy. And that's made even stronger by the fact that the puppy's asleep on the chair next to her, right? She's not. She can't sit still. She wants to go out. But mom said no. Now, nobody's going to think the little kid's up for picking up, right? They're available. But I think on a certain level, this picture, this girl can be seen as a sort of spiritual counterpart to Cassatt's own difficulties as a woman in 19th century France. Stuck inside, jonesing to go out, right? Wishing she could, and we see the light beckoning, right, from beyond, the light of the city. So many of Cassatt's pictures, right, show this same theme. It's a fairly recent acquisition, right? But women inside with the great world outside beckoning them, the world of the men, right? The Paris that Manet can paint freely, even though he works in the studio, right? He can walk around all he wants. Monet, all of the Impressionists can go outside and paint any part of this modern world they want. Cassatt is stuck inside. As Paris got renovated, right? We were talking a lot about modern Paris, what makes Paris so modern in the middle of the 19th century, with Baron Haussmann, right? The new boulevards, the new train stations, everything that made Paris this city that is today still is. Back in like, go to Paris, right? It became a spectacle. And it became, in the 19th century, something of a sport. Sport's maybe not the right word, but pastime. To wander the streets of Paris, just to see all the shops, all the other people that were outside. And there's a French word for this even, and there's no English translation for this. There's no ink in my pen either. Flaneur. A flaneur is somebody who enjoys the city as a spectacle, right? And walks through it, experiences FLA with the circumflex, NEUR, flaneur, right? The interesting thing about being a flaneur is that there is no feminine equivalent. So, you know the word masseur and masseuse? right? They're the same word. One's a man and one's a woman. A masseur is a man, and a masseuse is a woman. Back rub, right? That whole thing. There is no French word flaneuse. There is no female term for that word, indicating exactly what I'm talking about. This idea of wandering around Paris looking for spectacle, right? Soaking up the city, enjoying it like a movie or something. That's anachronistic, right? There weren't movies yet. But it was something that only men could do, or acceptable. Women could do it, but in the company of men. So you couldn't be a flaneur. All of you in the class would be interested, right? Everyone else didn't have that opportunity. And Cassatt's pictures seem to address that difficulty. Right? This is a great picture for sort of modern Paris, right? Where we see people out, but they're always accompanied, right? The girls that are here are in the company of other women, groups of women, little girls together, or in the company of a top-hatted man, right? This is a park in the center of Paris, La Grande Jatte. Actually, it's just outside of Paris, sort of pushing toward the suburbs, up the Seine, as it bends its way toward the ocean, but not that far away, very easy to get to, and people went there all the time. And this is from the last Impressionist exhibition in 1886, right? The very last Impressionist exhibition. And so, like the Impressionists, it shows modern life in a modern way, focusing on modern clothing, modern costumes, and this sort of modern melting pot of the park on a Sunday afternoon, right? The La Grande Jatte. This was the basis of the musical Sunday in the Park with George, right? Georges Seurat. So he's a younger artist. He's in. This was one of his, I think, his only second work ever with the Impressionists, and he only exhibited in the last two Impressionist exhibitions. So this is from the very last one in 1886. And he's moving in a slightly different direction. His attempts to use broken, non-academic brushwork is not to make the effort of making it look spontaneous. In fact, it's exactly the opposite. It looks incredibly deliberate. First, I think it's worth mentioning the size of this piece. It's really huge, 10 feet across the base, right? Almost 7 feet tall. So the figures on the right-hand border are slightly larger than life size, right? And if you want to see it, it's in Chicago, right? So next time you book a layover or something, go to the Chicago Art Institute and see this. Or go watch Ferris Bueller's Day Off, because there's a scene in there where they're hanging out in front of this picture, right? Ferris and his pals are. So by scale alone, you know it's nothing quick, right? 7 by 10 feet. But in addition to that, if we look closely about how Seurat applies the brushwork, it's not the flashy, momentary kind of brushwork that we see with Cassatt, that we see with Monet, or Pissarro for that matter. But rather, it's a series of tiny points and dashes. The entire surface is covered with just these dots, right? So we're looking at the details are right in here, just above the haunches of that Labrador here. And as you can see, the green, the dark green of that shadow, the edge of the sunlight, has a series of red and orange and blue ticks in it. Tiny dabs of paint. And the sunlit part, we can see more of the grass, and you can see that it too is made up of a series of colors, not necessarily as rich and varied as we see in the shadow. Now, Seurat called this divisionism. He's divided the color into all of these different dots. But the term that you hear more often, the term that historians use, is pointillism, which kind of makes sense. It's a series of points of color. And as you look at it, you can see quite clearly that this must have taken freaking forever to do, right? Dot by dot by dot by dot to slowly but surely build up the composition. And as you look at the figures, even though we've got some really weird croppings, right? Here's the edge of somebody's dress over here, right? Just off the frame. Right, the areas, his legs are chopped off here. There's nothing, even poses seem frozen. Like everybody in the picture, I think everybody, is either in profile or moving back into space. There's like nothing in the way of diagonals here. People don't move diagonally back into space, which we activated a bit more. Even the four guys in the rowboat in the back, right, going straight across the canvas from left to right or right to left. Yeah, everything moves. There's one little pug dog who's kind of going on that diagonal, and they've got a pet monkey, right? Which I always found kind of fascinating. It's very, they're out there to be seen, right? They're wearing the finest clothes, and they've got their. It puts them in a different sort of status than everybody else, right? We've got a pet monkey. And there is this sense of everybody coming together, this melting pot. You've got this fancy couple with the pet monkey. And then you got this guy here in the wife beater, smoking a pipe, a working class fellow with his sort of lab dog, and then this little guy here, a highly bred puppy about to sort of attack it. All the different elements of society coming together, but rendered in this new style, which is very different from the Impressionists. It's much more deliberate, right? It's much more, let's say, thoughtful, right? Rather than sort of quick and expressionistic, right? It's much more deliberate. And it comes out of the fact that there have been a series of sort of major developments in color theory from exactly this time. Charles Blanc had come up with the color wheel only in 1867. You guys all study this in color theory classes, right? You know it pretty well. The idea that you could arrange all of the colors in their gradations from the three primaries, red, yellow, blue, through the secondaries, green, orange, and violet, to the tertiaries, that you can arrange them on a continuous wheel, had only just been come up with by Charles Blanc in 1867. So it's a fairly new idea about the nature of color. How does color work? And in addition to that, there was a physicist named Ogden Rood who said that if you put colors from the color wheel next to each other on the surface, you will get an optical effect, that the eye will react to it. And so he said, if you want to get an orange, put a red next to a yellow, and the eye will blend them side by side. If you want the colors to really pop, then put the opposite from the color wheel next to it, and that vibration between oranges and blues, greens and reds, violets and purples, right? Those will make that area dance and will come forward. Right? These ideas are coming out of this physicist, Ogden Rood. And so when we look at Seurat's work, we find how many times he's using opposites next to each other, right, in order to give it that surface vibrance. But nothing about it seems spontaneous. Everything about it seems kind of quasi-scientific, as if he's using the composition to investigate the nature of color, right? The nature of paint, and how the different effects work on the surface. But again, if you look at the smoke coming off of this is that guy's pipe, right? Kneeling down here in his hand. He's not at all interested in sort of rendering the structure of the hand, right? But the smoke even coming up has just these tiniest little flecks of paint. And you can tell from the weave of the canvas how large of a detail this is. Right? So this is very different from Impressionism, even though it was part of the last Impressionist show. And let's see. Part of its deliberation was the fact that Seurat did a number of studies, went out to the Grand Jatte, did all sorts of sketches of different parts of the composition that he then brought back into the studio to make the monster canvas. We've got 5 or 6 of them in the National Gallery. Right? So here is one of the studies for, as you can see, some of the figures here. Sailboats in the background, this part of the shoreline over here, figures moving through it as well. And again, in that very deliberate, pointillist style. Even though it's a much smaller panel, this is tiny, it's about like this, right? So the brush strokes are bigger compared to the overall look, but still interested in putting colors next to each other and seeing what happens as your eye blends them, right? Now, in 1910, after Seurat is dead, Monet's still around, but Degas gone, right? Some art historians began to look at this work in particular, from 1886, other works from the last Impressionist show, and works by artists who had always been called Impressionists in the 80s and 90s. They started to look at these things and say, gosh, these are really not really Impressionism anymore. They're not trying to capture a momentary impression of flickering light. They're different from that. And they came up with a new term, post-impressionism. In fact, Seurat himself knew he was different. He called it neo-impressionism. He himself did. But the term post-impressionism was coined in 1910 to describe differences that our historians had begun to see in late impressionist pictures, particularly from the late 80s and the 1890s, where things are going in a different direction. And there wasn't really a post-impressionist movement. There wasn't artists getting together and saying, hey, we're all going to try and do the same thing. In the same way that Impressionism wasn't just one movement, right? There were different, Degas and Monet that started doing the same thing. Post-Impressionism was not sort of a concerted effort to go in a particular direction. It was an art historian's attempt to make sense of what they saw going on. And as we look at the works of art that got labeled post-impressionism, there are basically two generic camps for that art. One of them represented by Seurat, which is this sort of deliberate, intellectual approach to painting, where Seurat is really most interested in the nature of color and how it interacts. Very intellectual, right? Based on modern physics. The other camp is a group that's much more expressive. More expressive than the Impressionists hadn't really been expressive. A group that's interested in subject matter, whereas the Impressionists were not. Individuality. We'll see this as we work our way through. So Seurat falls into this one camp under the post-impressionists. This is a very, very intellectual approach to painting. And there are more than just two, but for the sake of this class and where we are, we're going to look at one other artist who falls into this same camp of sort of an intellectual pursuit of some ideas that the Impressionists had raised. And this artist is Paul Cézanne, one of the great painters, for my money, of all time. Absolutely fantastic. Had exhibited with the Impressionists. He was part of the original group. So go back to 1874, that group of 30 artists that got together to rebel against the Salon. Right? Cézanne was one of them. He showed with them again at the second exhibition in 1877. In both of these, he got horrible reviews. They singled him out. And I'll say this, his early paintings kind of suck, which I kind of like. Like when I was where you are, right? You're not a studio art major, but when I was a young studio art major, right? I was a 7-year undergrad because I didn't know what I wanted to do. Right? I guess I still don't because I'm still in college. So anyway, I was an art major, and I had to take art history, and that sort of defined. I did better at that than I did at studio art, so now I do it, right, for a living. But my paintings weren't all that good. I could draw, but my paintings weren't all that good. And when I took an art class, I realized that Cézanne didn't get good till he was like 30. I was going, yeah, there's still hope, right? I can still rock it. And I gave it up and became an art historian. fairly slow developer. So he's born in the south of France. Provence is this region down on the Mediterranean, right? Roughly the same latitude as northern Italy, and right on the banks of the Mediterranean. So that's where Nice is there, right? Marseille is there. In fact, this is very close to Marseille. Just on the other side of that mountain and down to your right a little bit is where Marseille is. Right near the coast. This is where he grew up. Little town called Aix-en-Provence. Cute little town, right? And he goes to Paris to make his career as an artist, as everybody does. His father didn't want him to, right? His father thought it was a stupid idea. But off he goes, gets rotten reviews, decides I'm going back to Provence. I've had it with the Paris art scene. And one of the things that we find with a lot of artists in the post-impressionist era, not Seurat, but some of the others, is an attempt to flee Paris. Right? Everybody came there before. The urban world was really important in a lot of the realist pictures. But and for the Impressionists, right? The area around Paris, Argenteuil. But for Cézanne and others, there's an idea of getting away from Paris. Get even further away from that structure. So he goes back to Provence. And here he's on the hills outside of this town of Aix, A-I-X, X. And he's looking toward this mountain. Mont Saint-Victoire, which he paints dozens of times throughout his career. He loves it. If you ever go down there, it looms, so you can't get away from it. Everywhere he looks, he's looking in the rearview mirror, and there it is. Sort of like follows you everywhere you go. So he had this studio on the outskirts of town. He used it as the basis to paint this on a number of different occasions, and we'll look at 3 or 4 of them. But he too, like Seurat, falls into this kind of intellectualized camp. Very deliberate camp. But in a slightly different way. So for Seurat, right, it was pointillism. It was these tiny little points of color that build up these forms that on a certain level end up looking kind of abstract because they're so meticulous, right? Look at the girl with the white hat next to the water on the left, behind the guy in the top hat. And how that bonnet comes down, and it becomes this weird sort of thing, doesn't it? Doesn't it almost look like anybody? You know what I'm talking about? The white and the red? Right? It ends up looking like a magnifying glass or something. Very, very meticulous, right? For Cézanne, he wants to add structure to the pictures. He said that he wanted to make pictures. Take it back. He said, I want to make Impressionism something permanent and lasting, like the pictures you see in museums. So that they sort of lost sight of what makes a picture permanent by becoming so momentary and instantaneous. I want to make it more permanent, like the stuff you see in museums. And throughout his career, he begins to focus on using the paint to structure a composition. To think about all of the elements of the composition and make sure that every building block that makes the entire composition has an important and active role to play in that composition. So everywhere we look, in this case, in the mid-80s, he starts to really use very deliberate and regularized brushstrokes that cover the entire surface of the picture with a sort of similarity of brushwork that make you aware that every part of the composition is playing a role in the composition. There are no 2D design classes. We talk about positive, negative space, right? You do drawings talk about positive. There is no negative space for Cézanne. Everything is a positive space, even in the sky. And I've got details of this. It's a little washed out here on the screen, but I think the details will show this, right? Everywhere we look at Cézanne, he's got these brushstrokes, right, just hatching his way through and carving things out. And as he does it, he stops worrying about trying to articulate what he's painting. And things in their three-dimensional nature sort of begin to disappear. Where did, a house like that, think about how does that house sit in the field that surrounds it? And it doesn't matter, it's just a compositional bit that fits in. Down here, what's going on with this field? Is this the top of another house here with trees in front of it? What's going on down here? But it's all part of composition. Every element, the artist's job is not necessarily to reproduce exactly what he sees. The artist's job is to take that and inspire him to make a composition, to compose with the paint, to structure the canvas. Cezanne has this wonderful quote that we should treat nature as if it were cubes, cones, and cylinders, each rendered as part of the structure. So break it down, rearrange it. And when we go to the places that he painted, which we can do very easily, right? A lot of these have been mapped out. One of the things that we find is that Cezanne worked on these over long periods of time, and he would often pick up his easel and go to a different spot over here and paint it from there as well, and then move back. It's not a single viewpoint. There's nothing really that impressionist about it, right? It's not a single moment. It's trying to understand or use the form to understand the structure of this composition. So everywhere we look, we find these brush strokes being very deliberately laid down, not pointillism by any means, but deliberately laid down to structure these different elements that are put together to make the composition. And as we even look at the negative space, the sky, we see that same hatching of paint everywhere we look. In fact, on a certain level, without the outline, you would be hard-pressed to see that there was a mountain there. Right? It's the same brush strokes, the same colors. And then catching those bits of the tree up above in that same sort of 60-degree diagonal stroking that we see everywhere within the work. And to give us a clue that, that this is a structure, this is a composition that's been built up, he loves leaving parts of it unfinished, so that you can see where he started with those strokes in the lower right corner, jamming them in a little bit, and then building them up more and more, to the point where things start to become no longer entirely realistic. What happens at the roof of that building, for example, right? Why does the color for it disappear off to the sides of it on either side? And he brings colors from the shadow into other parts of the composition. Because his job as a painter is not necessarily to replicate nature the way he sees it. His job as a painter is to structure a composition. Right? Now, like I said, he was part of the Impressionist movement. He started there, but he had a long career afterwards, a good 30 years down in Provence, where he begins to develop these ideas about the structure of composition in a new and radically sort of exciting way. Again, Mont Saint-Victoire does it repeatedly. This one from Baltimore, where there's this rock quarry nearby with these amazing red rocks. And here again, he's slightly later, 10 years later, he's lost some of those diagonal hatching strokes that he's playing with in the 1860s to get this sense of everything having a role to play in the composition. And instead, we get this idea of bringing the colors and activating each area with these patches, these scrubby patches, to where the darkest blue that we see is not in the sky, right, but in the mountain instead. And how the colors from the mountain end up working their way up into the sky and vice versa. And everything, like I said, structured as if it were geometrical shapes, something Cezanne absolutely loves. And then areas where it's hard to tell what's going on. Look at the upper right corner, for example, where that tree has come up. We can follow the branches of the tree. And then as it turns to the leaves, you can see that there seems to be a bit of sky left up there, but not really. He's just interested in sort of bringing colors into that area to enliven it. Here on the far left, it looks almost as if there's another mountain, but there's no outline to it whatsoever. It's just part of the composition being worked out in every possible way. Close-up of the mountain itself so we can see more clearly. It almost looks as if it's blurry in the center, but that's not the case. He's structuring it with these different sections of color that come in. And every part, the mountain which appears to be gray, is in fact an amalgam of all the colors we see elsewhere on the canvas. If I could paint like one person, Cezanne or Manet, right? I just think these guys, they're doing things with the brush that are pretty, they make it look easy, right? And you go out and you try and do it and you just go, what am I doing? Why am I even trying, right, to do this? I want to think of one more detail of this. I actually have two more details. Right, so we can see the degree to which, what I love about Cezanne is, like I said, there's no negative space. Even the sky has a solidity, right? Look at how he's painted that. I imagine that maybe he's inspired by clouds, but he's not really drawing the clouds anymore. What he's doing is he's making that little section of the sky into an active part of the composition that has a sense of almost three-dimensional structure, as much as the mountain next to it does. He's just a master at doing this sort of thing. What's going up next? Lower right corner. I don't know if you can see this, but he's used this dry tree that comes up as a way of breaking up the composition. And he comes over, and he does this so many times. He'll come back in and paint the areas between the trees, and then begin to treat each one of those as sort of a compositional building block to put together. So, we often think, I don't know, when I took painting classes, you paint the background and paint the trees over the top of it, right? And call it done. But what he does is he takes the negative space, which is the thing you see between the branches, right? The areas in here and here and here, and even over in here, and each one of those now becomes something to work with, right? Something to play with and paint back over the top of it and build it as a part of the composition that adds something positive to what's going on in the entire work, right? There are no dead areas. Each one becomes the opportunity to sort of work with the paint, come up with something that is a plus side for the composition. He lives all the way till sorry about that. You guys can't see anything. I just got rid of my screen. There we go. He lives till 1906. We recently had the 100th anniversary of his death. They had a big show at the National Gallery of his works from Provence. This is his garden in Aix-en-Provence, in the outskirts, and it's Mont Saint-Victoire again. Can you see it? Right? Only painted everything but Mont Saint-Victoire. Right? So the mountain comes up slopey on the left and then sort of breaks down on the right. And here it is. Right? But what he's done is he's not painted it. The most solid thing there is the bare canvas of the painting. And what he's using it is the basis for this arrangement of color everywhere else we look. And here, late in his life, becoming almost abstract in the way in which he uses color to structure a composition. It's inspired by sitting in front of that mountain. It's inspired by looking at that landscape, but at the same time, that's only a small part of what he's doing, right? That's just the basis. The most important thing for him is what he uses it for, which is to use these colors to arrange them on the canvas in a way that works as a composition. And so here at the end of his career, a work that seems almost unfinished, and maybe was thought of as yet. But we have a number of his works where he leaves bare canvas for us. And in this case, it couldn't be a better example of showing how the negative space and the positive space are sometimes inverted in his works. The foreground becomes the background, and the background becomes the foreground. And this is what makes Cezanne's works, to this day, inspiring for artists in the early 20th century, right? Picasso said that Cezanne was like a mother who looms over us. Right? Almost like a threat. Right? You got to do it this way. And Matisse, these are the two great artists of the early 20th century. Matisse said he's a father to us all. We can't do anything without him. But what he's interested in, and if we get a chance to look at Picasso, we'll see this, is this idea of a composition that's structured by these small areas of paint, broken up into quasi-geometric forms. And it's Cezanne's job to arrange them. Not based on what he sees, but based on this two-dimensional surface that he's looking at. So with Cezanne and Seurat, we have one direction of post-impressionism. I realize I have another Cezanne. I love Cezanne. I can do this because I'm in charge. Right? Did a number of still lifes, right, where he's doing exactly what we're talking about with the Mont Saint-Victoire pictures, where he's arranging things and then rearranging them in new and exciting ways. And so in each of these, right, he paints it's the same table in each of these pictures, right? And he paints it numerous times, arranged with apples and oranges and peaches, and sometimes some rugs that he has around the house, and sometimes some porcelains that he has around the house. And what he's doing is he's again, less concerned with articulating it based on the traditional rules of perspective. And perspective says, the rules of perspective say basically, that the way it works is that you close one eye and you stand stock still. Right? That's how Brunelleschi's perspective works. Stand still, one eye closed. Because binocular vision mixes it up. Because each of your eyes is at a different place, which means there's a different vanishing point. Right? This is why we see in 3 dimensions. Because if I look at Brenna, I can see more of her face with my left eye than I can with my right eye. Right? Or at least that side of your face. Yeah? And that's why things look more three-dimensional the closer they are to us. And the further away, the more flat they look. It's because of binocular vision. Right? The perspective only works if you close one eye and don't move. Cezanne is all about moving. Cezanne is all about violating those traditional rules. And so in these works, right, the table, if we look at the way the table is structured, the table is just an excuse for structuring these areas of color, these areas of paint, right? Look at the tabletop on the left and the area in the shadow underneath the peaches. One, how is that dish even sitting on that table? Right? The dish is sort of tipped up, almost as if he's not put something underneath it. He's just decided to paint the dish standing here, and then paint the table standing back here. And he's not trying to organize it into a single, rational, unified perspective scheme. Right? He's organizing it based on the rules of perspective. Trace the outline of that dish. What happens behind that pile of fruit? Right? It doesn't add up. Right? It seems like a perfect oval over here, and then you go, wait a second. That doesn't add up. And it's not that he couldn't. He's choosing not to. In the same way, it's not like he couldn't draw the table, but then he wants to use it as an excuse to bring these colors together. Trace that table on the left with your eye. Look across the front line of the tabletop. Notice how that disappears against the left border. He's obliterating it. Again, he's making choices based not on what he sees, but how he wants the composition to look. And then look at the right side of the table, right? And you'll notice that with perspective, the bottom edge of the table, right, should go converge toward the back, but they splay, right? Look at the back edge of the table, behind whatever that large piece of fruit is, and how that edge then, once you get past that piece of fruit, disappears, right? Disappears behind the glass, reappears by the milk jug, and then shifts up a bit on the left-hand side, right? And again, these are all little adjustments and choices that he's making as he works, with the idea, again, that it's about structuring the composition, not about replicating what he sees. He's consciously violating all of the rules of painting. The one on the right does the same thing. Look at the side of the table again, right? And again, it's the same table, but he hasn't painted it exactly the same way, right? He's made some choices. And again, it splays out wonky on the far right side, right? The front edge of the table doesn't line up underneath that white sheet. The left and right sides don't line up. The milk jug inside that piece of tapestry. We see the milk jug from the side, but we can still see down into the top. And it doesn't rest comfortably there. It's kicked off to the side. What happens with that vase or that wide bowl on the right? At the top of it, where we see on the front edge, it seems to come around with that scalloped edge. And then all of a sudden across the back, it's just straight. Right? These are places where Cezanne is deciding not to paint it the way it looks, but to paint it the way he thinks it needs to be for the composition. So this interest that we see with Cezanne in purposefully composing the picture fall into this sort of cerebral approach to painting that is post-impressionism, right? Different from Seurat, but similar in the fact that it's an intellectual pursuit. For Cezanne, physical properties of color, right? Physicists and all. For Seurat, for Cezanne, it's the structure of the composition. Quickly show you a couple of details. I'm sorry these are a little bit grainy, but you can see these places where he's really being bold with his choices, bringing these blues in down below, but also how the outline of that carved table, again, appear and disappear, and how many places he uses this as an excuse to sort of structure the different elements. Show you one more detail, and then I'll take the question, right? There's our pot in the background, where you, just like Mont Saint-Victoire, inside the pot are diluted colors of everything else in the composition, right? Everything is knitted together, everything is woven to render this overall composition. How's that?
A question, like when you said that he's doing the table like in verse, not because he don't know how to do it. How the others like know that? Did he tell that he did it like in a purpose?
Because we looked at enough of his composition. The question is, how do we know that he knew how to do it? You know that from looking at the hundreds of compositions that survive. That these are all conscious choices. We look at early drawings by him. We look at works throughout the course of this 40, 50-year career that he had. He started painting in the late 50s. We look through the course of that career, and we find him at various places making really interesting choices, and sometimes being much more faithful to what he saw. I'm choosing the rather more radical pieces to sort of illustrate what makes Cezanne Cezanne, right? But it's definitely the case that he knew exactly what he was doing. Okay, we'll wrap up Post-Impressionism on Thursday, and then spend a little bit of time talking about the final exam, what you can expect from that. I don't have it written yet, right, so I can't tell you exact number of slides, but just like I did on the midterm, as soon as I do have it written, I'll email you sort of with the overall sort of outline of what to expect from it, okay? But I've got other things to do this week than write that exam yet, and I don't know what I'm going to say on Thursday, so I can't really write the exam.